It was a Tuesday afternoon when the pipe under my kitchen sink decided it had endured enough of my culinary experiments. I've been living in my modest suburban home for about 3 years now, a quaint little two-bedroom with more character than square footage. The house was built in the 1970s, which meant it had charm, history, and unfortunately, plumbing that occasionally staged rebellions against modern life. This particular rebellion began with a slow drip that quickly evolved into something that sounded alarmingly like a waterfall inside my cabinet. Now, I should mention that I'm what you might call home repair challenged. My ex used to handle all our maintenance issues, but since our breakup 6 months ago, I've been forced to confront the harsh reality that YouTube tutorials can only take you so far. After flooding my kitchen floor twice and creating what I can only describe as an abstract water sculpture beneath my sink, I admitted defeat and called a professional. The plumbing company promised to send someone over within the hour. I spent the time frantically cleaning my already reasonably tidy home, because apparently, that's what single gay men do when a stranger is about to enter their domain. We panic clean. I changed my shirt twice, settled on a casual blue Henley that my friends said brought out my eyes, and tried to look like the kind of responsible adult who definitely hasn't been eating cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row. When the doorbell rang, I wasn't prepared for Jake. The company had sent over what could only be described as the physical embodiment of every handyman fantasy I'd never admitted to having. He stood on my porch with a toolbox in one hand and a clipboard in the other, wearing work jeans that fit him just right and a company polo that stretched perfectly across his broad shoulders. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and when he smiled and introduced himself, I noticed the slight crinkles around his warm brown eyes. "Hi, I'm Jake from Reliable Plumbing. You called about a leak." His voice was deep and resonant, with a slight hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. "Yes, hi, I'm Alex," I managed, stepping aside to let him in. "The kitchen sink is plotting against me. I think it's personal at this point." Jake laughed, and the sound did something strange to my stomach. Plumbing can be vindictive that way. Mind showing me where the battlefield is? I led him to the kitchen, suddenly very aware of the coffee mug collection that had accumulated by the sink and the slightly wilting plant on the windowsill that I'd been meaning to water. Jake set down his toolbox and immediately got to work, kneeling to inspect under the sink. "So, have you tried fixing this yourself?" he asked, his voice slightly muffled from inside the cabinet. I leaned against the counter, trying to appear casual. "I did, actually. I watched 3 YouTube videos and bought a wrench specifically for this occasion." The sink was not impressed with my efforts. He emerged with a knowing smile. "Let me guess, it got worse after you tried? How did you know? Is that some kind of plumber psychic ability?" "Just experience," he chuckled. "About 80% of my calls start with, 'I watched a YouTube video.'" There was something disarming about Jake's presence. As he worked, he explained what he was doing in terms I could understand, without being condescending. He talked about water pressure and pipe connections with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for discussing their favorite TV shows. "So, how long have you lived here?" he asked as he rummaged through his toolbox. "About 3 years," I replied. "It's my first house on my own. Well, not entirely on my own initially, but it's just me now." Jake glanced up, something in his expression shifting. "Recent breakup?" I was surprised by his directness. 6 months ago." "How could you tell?" "The house has that look," he said, turning back to the pipes. "Half-finished projects, some spaces that look lived in and others that seem untouched. Plus, there's a rectangle on the wall that's less faded than the rest where a picture used to hang." I looked at the wall he was referencing, slightly unnerved by his observation skills. "You should be a detective, not a plumber." "Nah, I like fixing things that can actually be fixed," he said with a slight smile. "People are much more complicated than pipes." As Jake continued working, I found myself opening up about my breakup with David. How after 4 years together, he decided he wanted to explore other options, which apparently meant my former gym instructor. Jake listened attentively, offering occasional comments that showed he was genuinely engaged in the conversation. "That's rough," he said, tightening something under the sink. For what it's worth, I think he made a massive mistake. I felt a flush creep up my neck. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Jake replied, emerging from under the sink to look at me directly. "You're funny. You admit when you need help. And you made fresh coffee while I've been working without me having to ask. Those are good qualities in my book." The way he held my gaze made me wonder if he was flirting or just being friendly. In my post-breakup state, my ability to read signals had become embarrassingly rusty. "So, what's the verdict on my sink?" I asked, changing the subject to safer territory. "The good news is I can fix it today," The bad news is I need to turn off your water main for about an hour while I replace this section of pipe. It's corroded pretty badly. Do whatever you need to do. I trust you, I said, and realized I meant it. There was something inherently trustworthy about Jake. He smiled and headed outside to locate the water main. I took the opportunity to quickly check my reflection in the microwave door and run a hand through my hair. What was I doing? This was a professional relationship. He was literally here to fix my plumbing, not my love life. When Jake returned, he announced the water was off and asked if I had any spare towels he could use to catch any residual water. I headed to the linen closet, grateful for a moment to compose myself. As the repair progressed, Jake asked for my assistance holding a flashlight while he worked in the cramped space under the sink. Our hands brushed occasionally, sending little jolts of electricity up my arm each time. At one point, he guided my hand to hold the light at a better angle, his fingers warm against mine. "Perfect," he murmured, his face just inches from mine in the confined space. Just like that. The double entendre hung in the air between us, neither acknowledging it directly. I became hyper-aware of our proximity, the scent of his cologne mingling with the earthy smell of work and metal. As we worked together, Jake shared bits of his own story. He'd been a plumber for 8 years, having learned the trade from his uncle. He was passionate about his work, finding satisfaction in solving problems and helping people. He lived alone with his dog, a rescue named Edison who, according to Jake, had more personality than most humans. "What about you?" I asked. "No significant other wondering why you're spending so much time fixing a stranger's sink?" Jake's hand stilled momentarily. "Not anymore. Ended a 2-year relationship about a year ago. He wanted me to go back to school, get a real career, as he put it." My heart skipped at the casual mention of he. So Jake was gay too. The information settled in my mind, rearranging possibilities like puzzle pieces. "His loss," I said, echoing his earlier sentiment. "Anyone who doesn't appreciate what you do clearly doesn't understand the panic that sets in when water starts spraying everywhere." Jake laughed, the sound reverberating in the small space. "Exactly. Plus, I love what I do. Why change that for someone else's idea of success?" Our conversation flowed easily after that, covering everything from favorite movies to childhood pets. I learned that Jake had grown up just one town over, that he played guitar in a local band on weekends, and that he could make an impressive homemade pasta sauce, a skill learned from his Italian grandmother. Then came the incident that changed everything. Jake had just finished installing the new pipe section and was about to turn the water back on. "Okay, I'm going to go outside and turn the main back on. Sometimes there's a surge of pressure when the water returns, so stand back just in case," he warned. I nodded, stepping away from the sink as instructed. Jake disappeared outside, and I waited, feeling oddly bereft in his absence even though I knew he'd be back in moments. When I heard the water rushing back through the pipes, I felt a momentary relief that quickly turned to panic as I realized Jake had forgotten to tighten something. Water began spraying from under the sink with impressive force, catching me directly in the chest. "Jake," I called out, frantically trying to remember where he'd placed the shut-off valve under the sink. He rushed back in, taking in the scene with wide eyes before diving toward me. In his haste to reach the cabinet, he slipped on the rapidly forming puddle and crashed into me. We both went down in a tangle of limbs, Jake landing half on top of me as water continued to spray around us. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the absurdity of the situation sinking in. Then Jake started laughing, deep-bellied laughs that shook his whole body, and I couldn't help but join in. We lay there on my increasingly soaked kitchen floor, laughing like idiots while my kitchen turned into a miniature swimming pool. "I swear this never happens," Jake gasped between laughs, pushing himself up slightly but still hovering above me. "That's what they all say," I quipped, suddenly aware of how close his face was to mine, water droplets clinging to his eyelashes. Something shifted in his expression, the laughter fading into something more intense. Time seemed to slow as his eyes dropped to my lips, a question in them that made my heart race. "I should probably fix that," he said softly, making no move to get up. "Probably," I agreed, equally still. The moment stretched between us, taut with possibility. Then Jake sighed and reluctantly pushed himself up, extending a hand to help me to my feet. Our fingers remained intertwined a beat longer than necessary before he released me and turned his attention back to the still-spraying sink. This time, he shut off the water properly before making the final adjustments. We worked in a charged silence, both pretending that the moment on the floor hadn't happened, though the awareness of it hung in the air between us. As Jake finished the repair and began cleaning up, I busied myself mopping the floor and hanging the soap towels in the bathtub. When we finally faced each other again, the The kitchen restored to order, but both of us still damp. There was an undeniable tension in the air. "So," Jake said, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's fixed now. Properly this time." "Thank you," I replied, feeling strangely formal after the intimacy we'd shared. "What do I owe you?" Jake named a figure that seemed reasonable, and I went to get my wallet. As I handed him my credit card, our fingers brushed again, and I looked up to find him watching me intently. "Alex," he started, then hesitated. "I don't usually do this with clients, but would you maybe want to grab coffee sometime? When I'm not on the clock and you're not in the middle of a plumbing emergency." My heart leapt, but caution held me back. "Isn't there some kind of professional code against that?" Jake smiled. "Probably, but I'm willing to risk a stern talking to from my boss if you are." I found myself returning his smile. "In that case, I'd like that." We exchanged numbers, the transaction feeling more significant than the repair he'd just completed. As Jake packed up his tools, there was a new lightness between us, a shared anticipation. At the door, Jake paused. "You know, most days I fix pipes and leave. But sometimes—" He looked at me with those warm brown eyes. "Sometimes I walk into a house and feel like I was meant to be there on that specific day." Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me. It was gentle, questioning, giving me every opportunity to pull away. Instead, I found myself leaning into it, my hand coming up to rest on his chest. The kiss deepened, becoming something more certain, more promising. When we finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Jake rested his forehead against mine. "I've been wanting to do that since you opened the door. Even with my obvious plumbing incompetence?" I asked, smiling against his lips. "Especially because of that," he laughed softly. It was endearing. He stepped back reluctantly, picking up his toolbox. "I should go. My next appointment is in 30 minutes. "Right. Of course." I tried to hide my disappointment. "But I'm free tomorrow evening," he added, his eyes never leaving mine. "If you are." "I am," I replied, perhaps too quickly. "Very free." Jake's smile widened. "Then it's a date. I'll text you." I watched from the doorway as he walked to his truck, turning back once to wave before climbing in. As the truck pulled away, I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart racing and a smile I couldn't suppress spreading across my face. Who would have thought that a broken pipe could lead to something so unexpectedly wonderful? The house felt different somehow, as if the air itself had changed. For the first time since David left, I felt a genuine excitement about the future, about possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider. I walked back to the kitchen and ran the tap, watching the water flow smoothly down the drain. Jake had fixed more than just my plumbing today. He'd reminded me that connections can happen when you least expect them, that sometimes the most ordinary days can turn extraordinary in an instant. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. I already knew I'd be changing my shirt at least 3 times before our date, and that I'd probably clean the apartment again even though he'd already seen it at its worst. But most importantly, I knew I'd be going into this with my heart open, something I hadn't been ready for until a plumber with kind eyes and skilled hands showed up at my door and turned off my water, but somehow turned my heart back on. As I moved through my house that evening, I found myself pausing at that rectangle of unfaded wall that Jake had noticed earlier. Tomorrow, I decided, I would hang something new there. Something that represented this unexpected new beginning. Because sometimes, the spaces we think are empty are just waiting to be filled with something better than what was there before. And sometimes, it takes a broken pipe to show you that your heart isn't broken after all. It's just been waiting for the right person to help it flow again. Total_char_count. 17,423.